I'm Michelle Marinkovich, the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at Stanford, and I'm very delighted to see you here for what's the last in this year's award-winning Teachers on Teaching series of talks. But we will have another series next year, so don't worry, and please be on the lookout for announcements about those. Today we're very grateful and very gratified to have Professor Rob Reich of the Political Science Department, the Program in Ethics in Society, and the School of Education talking to us about the Socratic Method, what it is, and how to use it in the classroom. When Rob first suggested this title, I realized that it was the first time in the 8 years that we have been sponsoring this series that anyone had chosen to speak on this topic, even though arguably the Socratic Method is the most hallowed of our teaching traditions, at least in the West. So thank you, Rob, for making sure that we have finally addressed it. To tell you a little bit more about Professor Reich, he is partially a Stanford product because although he got his bachelor's in philosophy, magna cum laude, from Yale in 1991, he then did come to Stanford and completed a master's in philosophy and a PhD in the philosophy of education at the Stanford School of Education. Now, we have heard a lot in recent months and years about the importance at Stanford of interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. President Hennessy spoke on this topic last year in one of his major addresses, and just the other day, Professors Baker and Holloway also talked about interdisciplinarity and how important it is to our being able to tackle problems of real complexity and depth. And if that is the case, Rob is marvelously positioned to tackle the very thorny and important kinds of issues that preoccupied him in his book, Bridging Liberalism and Multiculturalism in Education, and in the many, many articles and presentations that he has already given addressing the question of moral issues in education. Knowing this about Rob, you also won't be surprised to hear that he has already, besides the appointments I mentioned in Political Science School of Education and the Program in Ethics in Society, is also affiliated with the Program in Human Biology, the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, the Haas Center for Public Service, and the Graduate School of Business's Center for Social Innovation. He has also already won a wide variety of prestigious awards, from fellowships from the Academy of Education and from the Stanford Humanities Center to his selection for Harvard's Young Faculty Leadership Forum. And although Rob only completed his PhD 5 years ago, next month, he's already won the ASSU Distinguished Teaching Award in 1999-2000 and the university's highest teaching award, the Walter J. Gores Award for Excellence in Teaching, in 2001. And I predict many, many honors in both the teaching and the research areas to follow. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rob Reich.
Thanks. Oops, yeah, thanks. That was a very generous introduction. If ever anyone is depressed, you should just get Michelle to introduce you somewhere. You feel a lot better about yourself. I have to confess that giving a lecture on the Socratic Method strikes me as a bit silly. And although Michelle mentioned that I've won a few of these teaching awards, I have to confess that at least in my own assessment, if I have any skill in classroom teaching, it is in leading classes Socratically and not in delivering lectures. So I want to diminish your expectations about what you're about to experience from me, although I'm going to try and give you a flavor of the Socratic Method, at least at the end of this session. So I want to try and do 4 things with the time I have with you. First, I want to talk about what the Socratic Method is, and I'll use a video clip to try and illustrate this. Second, I want to break down the Socratic Method into its essential components. Third, I'll offer some tips about how to use the Socratic Method in the classroom. And fourth, as I just mentioned, I want to try a bit of it here with you, engaging in a short dialogue, perhaps in the last 15 minutes or so of our time. All right, so let me begin then with trying to tell you a little bit about my take on what the Socratic Method is. And I thought that I'd begin not with my own words, but with a video clip that gives perhaps the most popular and most impressive model of the Socratic Method that we're all familiar with. And this is Professor Kingsfield from the movie The Paper Chase. The Paper Chase came out in 1973. I'm going to show you two short clips from The Paper Chase. The first clip is from the very opening of the movie, the very first scene. And the second clip comes shortly thereafter. So let me just turn it over to this, as long as I can handle this technology here.
Mr. Hart, you recite the facts of Hawkins versus McGee. I do have your name right. You are Mr. Hart.
Yes, my name is Hart.
You're not speaking loud enough, Mr. Hart. You speak up.
Yes, my name is Hart.
Mr. Hart, you're still not speaking loud enough. Will you stand? Now that you're on your feet, Mr. Hart, maybe the class will be able to understand you. You are on your feet.
Yes, I'm on my feet.
Loudly, Mr. Hart. Fill this room with your intelligence. Now, you give us the facts of the case.
I haven't read the case.
Class assignments for the first day are posted on the bulletin boards in Langdale and Austin Halls. You must have known that.
No.
You assumed that this first class would be a lecture, an introduction to the course.
Yes, sir.
Never assume anything in my classroom. Mr. Hart, I will myself give you the facts of the case. Hawkins versus McGee is a case in contract law, the subject of our study. A boy burned his hand by touching an electric wire. A doctor who was anxious to experiment in skin grafting asked to operate on the hand, guaranteeing that he would restore it 100%. He took a piece of skin from the boy's chest and grafted it onto the unfortunate boy's hand. The operation failed to produce a healthy hand. Instead, it produced a hairy hand. A hand not only burned, but covered with dense, matted hair. Mr. Hart, what damages do you think the doctor should pay?
I'm going to forward now to the second clip of Mr. Hart's encounter with Professor Kingsfield. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have seen the movie already? Oops. Have seen the movie. Okay, only about half. Good. Well, I'm giving the rest of you a treat, perhaps. It comes very soon, don't worry.
Unlike any schooling you have ever been through before. We use the Socratic method here. I call on you, ask you a question, and you answer it. Why don't I just give you a lecture, because through my questions you learn to teach yourselves. Through this method of questioning, answering, we seek to develop in you the ability to analyze that vast complex of facts that constitute the relationships of members within a given society. Questioning and answering. At times you may feel that you have found the correct answer. I assure you that this is a total delusion on your part. You will never find the correct, absolute, and final answer. In my classroom, there is always another question to follow your answer. Yes, you're on a treadmill. My little questions spin the tumblers of your mind. You're on an operating table. My little questions are the fingers probing your brain. We do brain surgery here. You teach yourselves the law, but I train your mind. You come in here with a skull full of mush, and you leave thinking like a lawyer.
All right. So, I'm here to tell you that despite popular impression, Professor Kingsfield is not a practitioner of the Socratic method, at least as would be understood by Socrates. We can perhaps call this teaching by the case study method, teaching by questioning and answering, or as probably law students would call it today, cold calling. But whatever it is, it's not the Socratic method. Now, I'd like to add here that some people, perhaps many people, react to Professor Kingsfield as deploying a kind of pedagogical torture, teaching in such a way as designed to humiliate, embarrass, browbeat, and otherwise stupefy students. Now, I don't want to say this. Kingsfield method, whatever you want to call it, I think has its own virtues. But the core aspect of Kingsfield's method is simply to call on people randomly, asking only questions. Now, you might wonder, do people like Professor Kingsfield actually exist? I haven't been a student at a law school or at a business school where you might expect to find this pedagogy. But for anyone who's been associated with Stanford for a while, I can tell you about an experience I had with one of the most esteemed professors at Stanford named Jim March. I was in a class with Jim March where we were all subject to what he called his infamous bingo machine. Students would file into the class, and at the door, they would receive a number. We would assume our seats, and then Professor March at the front of the room would spin his bingo ball tumbler. Out would come a number, and if your number came up, you were on the hot seat for 15 minutes with him asking you questions. So there are Professor Kingsfields still alive, well, and kicking, but what I want to try and disabuse you of is the fact that they're practicing the Socratic method. So what then is the Socratic method, in my view, as inspired by Socrates and as actually practiced by modern-day teachers? Well, first we can say that the Socratic method is emphatically not teaching in the conventional sense of the word. This is the obvious contrast, of course. The leader of Socratic inquiry is not the purveyor of knowledge, filling the empty minds of largely passive students with facts and truths acquired through years of study. As the people in the School of Education would say, the Socratic teacher is not a sage on the stage. There are no lectures and no need for rote memorization. But neither, as you perhaps might expect, again in the language of the School of Education here, neither is the Socratic teacher a guide on the side. In the Socratic method, the classroom experience is a shared dialogue between teacher and students in which both are responsible for pushing the dialogue forward through questioning. The teacher, or the leader of the dialogue, asks probing questions in an effort to expose the values and beliefs which frame and support the thoughts and statements of the participants in the inquiry. And the students ask questions as well, both of the teacher and of each other, and the inquiry progresses interactively. The teacher, and here's the key, is as much participant as guide in the discussion. And furthermore, the inquiry, as we all know from Socrates' famous line, is open-ended. We follow the discussion where it goes. There is no predetermined argument or terminus to which the teacher attempts to lead the students. And for those of you then who will want to practice the Socratic method, you will have to dispense with PowerPoint. Without a lesson plan, you follow the dialogue where it goes. Let me try and break down for you at least my take on the 4 essential components of the Socratic method. Number 1, the Socratic method uses questions to examine the values, principles, and beliefs of students. So through questioning, the participants first strive to identify and then to defend their moral intuitions about the world, which undergird their own way of life, their own values. Socratic inquiry deals not with producing a recitation of facts, a la Professor Kingsfield, or a questioning of the internal logic of various and sundry abstractions, which are held up for comparison, but rather demands that participants account for themselves their own thoughts, actions, and beliefs. Socratic inquiry aims to reveal the motivations and assumptions upon which students lead their lives. Thus, practitioners of the Socratic method want students to know the facts, say, of the cases, but they want to focus more on what the student thinks about the cases, how to analyze the cases, as clearly Professor Kingsfield may lead his students to do. But the key insight here is that the relevant focus of inquiry is not what other people think about the case, but what you think about the case. Citing another authority, if a law student in Professor Kingsfield class had said, well, I've read Professor Hart on this case, and his analysis was X, that would surely be unsatisfactory and should be so in a Socratic inquiry. Second feature, the Socratic method focuses on moral education and how one ought to live. And in this sense, Socratic inquiry proceeds in a style which might seem a little unsettling to people. It proceeds in an ad hominem style. The Socratic inquirer directs his or her questions at individuals. That is, rather than making arguments or asking questions designed to convince any or all people of something, all comments in Socratic inquiry are directed at specific participants in the discussion. The subject of inquiry is not what is thought generally or is said about the world, but what each participant thinks or says about the world. The goal is not to consider depersonalized propositions and abstractions, but to probe the underlying values and beliefs of each inquirer. Now, since the substance of Socratic inquiry are the beliefs and values of the participants, when those beliefs or values are challenged, or worse, refuted, it's nothing less than the coherence of the student's life that is at stake. As Socrates often says in the Platonic dialogues, he's primarily concerned with how one ought to live. Here's one of the more representative lines from the Socratic dialogues. Socrates says, "Do not take what I say as if I were merely playing, for you see the subject of our discussion. And on what subject should even a man of slight intelligence be more serious? Namely, what kind of life should one live?" Refutation of one's beliefs about how best to live delivers an implicit verdict that might remind you of one of the last lines of Rainer Maria Rilke's most famous poems, the archaic Torso of Apollo, in which he concludes, "You must change your life." You can remind yourself, too, of course, of Socrates' perhaps most famous line, the one that anyone who's never taken a philosophy class will nevertheless know, "The unexamined life is not worth living." You perhaps also heard it said, and I think a Socratic teacher is obliged to tell students this as well, that the following proposition is equally true, though less appreciated. If the unexamined life is not worth living, it must also be said that the unlived life is not worth examining. Third essential component. The Socratic method demands a classroom environment characterized by what I will call productive discomfort. In the best of Socratic dialogues, there's real tension among the interlocutors. The stakes are high. Will one be called on to account for oneself in a way that calls into question the underlying values and beliefs upon which one has been leading his or her life? This is no small thing, and to the extent that in the context of the interplay in a discussion, one is called to account for oneself, there can quite naturally be tension or resistance or fear. But that fear can be turned into a productive thing. I would I'll try and contrast for you a little bit later the fear that exists in Professor Kingsfield's classroom that is not necessarily productive versus the productive discomfort that I would want to generate and advocate in a Socratic classroom of the sort I would wish to teach. So fourth and final essential component here. The Socratic method, it has to be admitted, is better used to demonstrate the complexity, difficulty, and uncertainty about the world than at eliciting facts about the world. And here I want to quote a nice line from the philosopher Bertrand Russell. It's not that it's only philosophical topics or things that are of a moral nature that one can inquire about Socratically. You can certainly inquire about things that are straightforwardly factual about the world Socratically, but you have to aim at something else. And so here's a line from Bertrand Russell, which I think illustrates this quite well. Russell says, "The first difficulty in any inquiry is to see that the problem is difficult. If you say to a person, 'How do you know that I have two eyes?' he or she will reply, 'That's a stupid question. I can see that you have.' But it's not to be supposed that when our Socratic inquiry is finished, we shall have arrived at anything radically different from this unphilosophical position. What will have happened will be that we shall have come to see a complicated structure where we thought everything was simple. That we shall have become aware of the penumbra of uncertainty surrounding the situations which inspired no doubt, and that we shall find doubt more frequently justified than we supposed, and that even the most plausible premises will have shown themselves capable of yielding implausible conclusions. The net result," Russell concludes, "is to substitute articulate hesitation for inarticulate certainty." So, summing up at least my take then on the Socratic method, contra Professor Kingsfield. In the Socratic method, the Socratic professor is not an opponent in the argument. He's not someone who plays devil's advocate as a matter of principle, taking, for example, the following line as his or her guidepost in teaching. If you affirm it, I deny it. If you deny it, I affirm it. This may happen sometimes, but it cannot be a matter of pedagogical principle. Contra Professor Kingsfield, the Socratic professor does not actually possess all the knowledge and just tests the students. The professor himself or herself must be a participant in the dialogue and must always be open to learning something, him or herself. Now, it follows from this that, again, contra Professor Kingsfield, the Socratic professor does not seek deference to his or her authority. He or she does not create a cult of personality by seeming aloof, cold, and distant. Contra Professor Kingsfield, the Socratic professor actually knows the names of his or her students, and the students know each other's names. If you watch the rest of the movie, you'd see that in every interaction he has with the students, he has to wander over to his seating chart, first to get the name, and then to grill the student. And finally, contra Professor Kingsfield, the Socratic professor aims for productive discomfort, not fear and intimidation. The aim is not to strike fear into the hearts of students so that they come to class prepared, but to strike fear in the hearts of students so that that either they can articulate clearly the values that guide their lives, or to worry that their values and beliefs may not withstand scrutiny. Let me then try and boil this down to some practical guidelines. I'll give you 10 classroom tips for using the Socratic method. And I want to acknowledge here that I'm borrowing somewhat from a classic essay, which may be familiar to some of you, by a fellow named Stringfield Barr, who wrote something called Notes on Dialogue. I recommend it to you if you haven't seen it. So 10 classroom tips for the Socratic professor. Number one, in the very beginning of class, you need to set down some conversational guidelines. You should learn your students' names. You should have them learn each other's names. So practically speaking, what I tell students is that if you are responding to someone else's comment in class, you ought to say, well, I want to respond to what Stephen said because it stimulated the following in me, rather than I just heard this or I just heard that. Encourage very consciously referring to other people by name. And of course, then you have to model that as the instructor. You need to explain, of course, that participation requires listening. And it's very important to convey to students, especially Stanford students in my experience, who come to class having heard all the time that class participation is crucial, but who think that fulfilling class participation requirements simply means listening, coming up with a question, raising his or her hand, offering the one comment, and then sinking back into oblivion, having participated once in class. Inserting your single comment into the class dynamic and then resting back for the rest of the day is no good. And this is why it's especially important to emphasize the give and take between people. Unless you're paying attention to what's going on in class, you can't make a productive comment. You ought to discourage, I would suggest, comments of the sort that take you off on a totally different track in conversation unless you feel like the current track you're on has been exhausted or you want to move on yourself. Finally, I think it's very important to at least say, again, consciously at the beginning of a class, that you want to focus in your discussions on concepts and principles, not on first-person narratives. The tendency, especially in philosophy courses, can sometimes be to elicit from students anecdotal information that it illustrates some principle or value that they may have, but the student, him or herself, has yet to articulate that cleanly. First-person narratives are fine if they push somewhere deeper, but simply in and of themselves, it's not enough. Second tip, ask questions, obviously, but then more importantly, be comfortable with the silence that may follow. Silence can be productive. Be willing to wait for students to respond. There is no necessary need, however deep your instincts may tell you otherwise, to fill a conversational void. Silence actually creates a helpful tension. So if I were to ask a question and then pause, no one raised his or her hand, I didn't call on anyone, as the seconds ticked on, you can begin to see students do this. Someone, almost inevitably, will step in because they are as uncomfortable as you are. If you needed a helpful guideline, you could just give yourself the 10-second wait rule. After any question, be willing to wait 10 seconds until you step in to push forward again. Third, how do you produce productive discomfort? Now, I would want to confess that in line with Professor Kingsfield, my tactic often is to use cold calling. I do feel comfortable, and I expect students to feel comfortable being called on without having raised their hands. But I try and temper this by often beginning class with an exercise where I frame a question, I frame what we're going to talk about, and then I say, I want you to take 3 or 4 minutes to talk with the person next to you, or talk with the 3 people around you. Which means in the worst case scenario, if someone is totally petrified in coming to class and participating, especially having been called on, in the worst case scenario, they can simply parrot back to the class what they've just discussed with their neighbor. I use language like that in class, talk to your neighbor, and occasionally I get back on student evaluations that my class feels occasionally like elementary school. I think that's a price worth paying. Now, above all else, once you ask a question, be willing to follow up on the question. One of the tendencies, I think, of professors, teachers in general, is to think that they're gaining class participation by asking students questions, but then simply affirming or acknowledging that the students have participated. Actually going back to the student to press the student further will be of the first importance for a Socratic inquiry, but I want to suggest, and then based on my own experience, that the students will find this enormously stimulating. They probably haven't, in their Stanford experience, very often been asked follow-up questions from a professor. I have received on student evaluations, Professor Reich's class is wonderful because he asks us questions. And I've told them quite honestly on occasion that they have extraordinarily low expectations. Fifth tip, you as the teacher have to be open to learning something new. And this is why you have to at least devalue or totally discard the idea of a lesson plan where if you don't get to the last point by the end of class, you have somehow not done your job. If something interesting comes up, again, the School of Ed folks would call this a teachable moment arises, be willing to pursue it, not knowing how it's going to turn out. I think if you asked yourself and asked most people, what are the very best classroom experiences you've ever had? Many of them will have been spontaneous or unpredictable classroom experiences that you couldn't have seen ahead of time. So again, you can't be a sage on the stage or a guide on the side. You have to be willing to say to people, I don't know the answer to that question, or your answer has convinced me. Sixth tip. You have to distinguish between welcoming the totally crazy idea that's offered in class and discouraging those ideas that aren't really serious, but are attempts to sort of escape serious engagement in the discussion. I'll try and give an example of that later in the dialogue that we'll have. Seventh, you should emphasize that brevity and short interventions are much more welcome than short lectures from either you or students. That tends to deaden discussion. Eighth, and I think this is particularly important at Stanford, you should avoid and seek to break down obsequious deference to your authority and your status as a professor.